everybody, and welcome to A Good Place where truth and integrity meet, where I'll be introducing you to thought-provoking and compelling premier educators, whistleblowers, best-selling authors, journalists, activists, and celebrities. And I have one of these people with me today, one of the most famous whistleblowers of all time, Mr. Bradley Birkenfeld. And so let me give you a little background on him. And he is one of the most significant whistleblowers in history, as I mentioned, and as an international private banker, he exposed how UBS, the world's largest bank, helped ultra-wealthy Americans commit billions in tax fraud. His bombshell revelations cracked the impenetrable fortress of Swiss banks, proving that offshore financial institutions systematically aided clients, tax evasion, corruption, and terrorist activities. His case triggered monumental changes in banking laws, the federal tax code, and international tax treaties. He was soon vindicated with a record-breaking IRS reward in which he was awarded $104 million, and his work had enabled the U.S. Treasury to recover $15 billion in back taxes, fines, and penalties. And the case set off a domino effect of international investigations into offshore banking, secret crimes, including the Panama Papers, and much more. Now retired, Birkenfeld is a philanthropist and supports whistleblowing efforts worldwide. He has taken the story to paper, and he is the author of Lucifer's Banker, The Untold Story of How I Destroyed Swiss Bank Secrecy. He has appeared on 60 Minutes and the New York Times and almost every news publication out there. So welcome, Brad, to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here again.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Ella, and thank you so much for having me on for a second time.
Great. And so I guess we should start at the beginning. How did you get into the banking business?
Well, it's interesting. I grew up in Boston as the youngest of three boys, and I sort of geared myself towards finance and economics in my studies. And I started at a bank here, an institutional bank called State Street Bank, managing pension plan assets and dealing with banks around the world from Boston, Massachusetts. So that's really where my start commenced in banking, and it was really quite an interesting endeavor because I learned so much about the banking systems that we work with today, and currencies and stock markets and so forth. So that's where it started, and then from there I had left State Street after about 4 years, and I went to Switzerland to get my master's in finance, in which I completed that, and then was hired right out of school. Actually, while I was still in school, I got a job offer from Credit Suisse Private Banking in Geneva, Switzerland.
Okay. And did you work for you? How did the UBS come into the story? Did you work for them directly? Were you contracted? What capacity did you work for them?
It's a good question. So for your audience that doesn't understand Switzerland, just to give a little bit of a background because it's quite interesting, Switzerland is not part of the European Union. It doesn't use the euro currency. It uses the Swiss franc. And that's quite interesting because they're like a little island within all of Europe, which is the EU. It's about 7.5 million people, and they have a long tradition of never being successfully invaded, back to 1291 when they were founded as a confederation, which matches our constitution as well. So it's quite interesting, and it's been known for Swiss bank secrecy, which was implemented as a direct result of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich coming to power. Adolf Hitler had indicated that he would have anyone shot dead if they moved any money outside of the country. And the reason for that was they were building the money for the war effort. It's not right, of course, but it was just, that's the logic, was we want to keep the money in the country to build up for the war effort, which we know the result of that. But then Switzerland countered this with Swiss bank secrecy in Article 47 in 1934, which said, if anyone brings money to Switzerland and deposits it into a bank, we will never disclose the identity of that person. I mean, this is very powerful because this made a lot of sense at the time to protect people's identity. Unfortunately, we had the Holocaust issue where the Swiss were not forgiving for giving up assets of people who were murdered, and that was a big problem, and that got settled in 1998 by the World Jewish Congress for $1.3 billion, the three big banks in Switzerland at the time. That was Credit Suisse, Swiss Bank Corporation, and UBS. UBS later merged with Swiss Bank Corp, so the big three became the big two. And ultimately, I started to work for UBS in 2001, right after 9/11. And I was a director of the bank at their offices in Geneva as the head of business development for all of North America.
And so you knew, I'm sure that it, in an unspoken way, that this was a great tax shelter for the rich and wealthy and famous. So if there's anything that that the Swiss take more seriously than their chocolate, it's the secrecy of their banks, from what I understand. And I heard about it even in the no, I was a little girl, maybe 80s. My father had talked about these Swiss banks. Being European, being Swedish, he knew all about it. And so when I think back, I mean, however long this has been going on with this, with keeping your money in Switzerland to avoid taxes and other things that might affect. It could be just they're hiding it from their spouses, their families. So there's all kinds of factors that play into that. When I think back imagine how much money the IRS has not been able to procure with the Swiss banks, when the Swiss banking systems.
Well, this is exactly right. You raise a very good point, and I think it's important for your audience to understand that when you look at it in the magnitude of what we're talking about in Geneva, now again, Geneva was about 200,000 residents, give or take. And it's a small village. It's a very cute town, very clean and orderly, like all of Switzerland. But there was 135 banks when I was there in 2008. 135 banks for that many people is about one bank for each 1,600 people. So it's an incredible amount of banks. And it's not Swiss money in those banks. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing is this has been going on for decades, if not centuries, about hiding monies, more so in the 1900s, because what had happened was global trade advanced, people were moving around the world, jet airplanes were helping people facilitate business as well as travel and so forth. So when you think about 130 banks and what happened years ago where people died and then that money vanished because the IRS could never get their hands on it. So you not only have money put into a Swiss bank for a variety of reasons, estate planning, hide it from a spouse, hide it from a business partner, and hide it from the tax authorities. But the problem now comes into what was done with that money over those years. Did you have insider trading? Did you have bribery, extortion, prostitution, drugs, guns, terrorist financing, and so forth? So if you have no accountability and transparency, in effect, you don't know what's really going on. Mm-hmm. So this is the real troubling factor here, because this, as I said, was going on for decades, and you can only imagine the money's not just in the bank accounts, but what about physical assets such as maybe a chalet or a private jet or a private yacht or safe deposit boxes, jewelry, artwork. Those things can be moved around quite freely, and they're not traceable. So there's a whole other element here of this offshore banking where it's even harder to get to the bottom of it. So that's really something to keep in mind as well.
Okay. And I know you can't probably tell me who was the most interesting or complex person. I just wanted to hear like who or what that person did. I guess that way you can't get in trouble. The kind of positions that people held and the kind of work that people did that came to you.
Well, there's one person in particular that I gave to the Department of Justice in my book called Lucifer's Banker, and his name was Abdulaziz Abbas. Now, that's an Iraqi national. Now, you may ask yourself, well, why are we talking about this person? Well, this person's very interesting because at the bank, you're not allowed to give up any names, and the Department of Justice refused to give me a subpoena to protect me for Swiss bank secrecy, where I lived at the time in Geneva, Switzerland. I would go to jail if I gave up any name. So I asked for a subpoena, and they refused. I later got it from the U.S. Senate. But because this person was dealing in terrorist financing, I was allowed to give his name up, and that was the first name I gave up. And it's actually in my book. You can see the actual index card of this individual, which I made a copy of. And someone might say, well, why did you take that from the bank? Well, because he was breaking the law. That's why, terrorist financing. What he was doing was making illegal oil sales with Saddam Hussein, and he had 6 numbered accounts in Geneva, Switzerland, and he had over $420 million in those accounts. Now, the first red flag should be that's a lot of money for one person to have. But, we've had some big clients like that. But in particular, he had 6 numbered accounts, and he's an Iraqi national on the U.S. desk in Geneva. Had a $50 million condo in the Olympic Tower in New York City. So you begin to ask yourself, wait a minute, this is quite troubling, because there's a gentleman who lives in New York City who has this large six-numbered accounts of assets in Geneva, and he was making illegal oil sales with Saddam Hussein. So the very fact that nothing was done by the Department of Justice, because when I brought it to their attention and told them this story under oath, under the pains and penalties of perjury, they said, we're not interested in non-Americans. And I said, this is really quite unusual. And I said, no, you have to understand, this man should be investigated. And they said, we're not interested. And they put their hand in my face. So later on, I had done an interview with Steve Croft on 60 Minutes. And he asked me the same question. He said, well, what do you think we should do about this? I said, Steve, you're a very good investigative reporter. I think you should probably go interview the 3,000 families that had their loved ones murdered on 9/11 and ask them if they care, because the Department of Justice doesn't care. And, of course, they cut that right out of the interview. So the reason why I raised this with you and your audience, and it's people should be outraged, literally outraged, that as a whistleblower, I brought in a bad guy who had $420 million in Geneva, lived in a $50 million condo in New York City. Why do we let this happen? Why haven't they done anything?
Mm-hmm. And what exactly compelled you to come forward and reach out to the DOJ? Was there something that happened between you and the bank? There must have been something that really stood out that seemed to be what initiated your actions.
Well, it's a good question. You have to understand what we did in Switzerland was legal. Under the Constitution and under the laws of Switzerland, as a resident and an employee there, I was managing people's money in a Swiss bank account, which is fine. Now, the question came in when we traveled outside of the country to go to, say, America, or to go to, say, Germany or France or whatever. You're generally not licensed to do banking operations. Now, the bank had slipped in a 3-page document into our intranet, and they never told us about this document. They never trained us on this document, and it effectively contradicted everything they were telling us to do. So when a colleague brought it to my attention, I immediately brought it to my boss and then to legal and compliance and complained in writing over 3 months and never got an answer. So that's ultimately why I resigned, because I could see this was a setup where the bank was protecting their interests but throwing the bankers, the clients, and the shareholders under the bus. So this was a very serious thing, and I quit my job. I wasn't fired, and I quit. And actually, I started whistleblowing long before the whistleblowing law was ever passed in America. So when people said, well, you must have done this for the money, no, I was ethically right in what I did, and I did it a year and a half before the whistleblowing law was ever passed in the United States. So those are very important facts for your audience to digest. And I think the other thing that's more important is I'm the only person in U.S. history that's brought back over $20 billion now. It's actually approaching $25 billion of proceeds back to the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. taxpayers. Nobody in history has ever done this. Nobody.
Were you frightened? I mean, something when I hear the type of people and the clientele that use these Swiss accounts, weren't you frightened of the retaliation? Because we're talking about, or even from the bank, because you're talking about billions and millions and billions of dollars. And we know that rich entity or corporations and entities and individuals, they all have quote unquote fixers, from what I understand. Is that true?
Well, you have all kinds of people that are involved in this industry. You have lawyers, you have individuals that refer business to the bank, accountants and so forth, other bankers. And then you have, of course, some very shady people that actually do business in Switzerland. You can only imagine. And, beyond evading tax, that's one thing, and that's not right, of course, but I'm more concerned about the serious transgressions such as prostitution and drugs and arms smuggling and terrorist financing and so on and so forth, because those affect not just the United States, but the world. So you really have a big, big problem there, and if it goes unchecked, it keeps blossoming, if you will, and metastasizing. So I think a lot of people understand that there should be put an end to this business, and that's what I tried to do. I don't think I was scared per se. I was more furious because the way in which I was treated at the bank as a director, and I was a very good employee who made them a lot of money and my clients' money as well. But then, of course, the problem comes to the fact that I was I was the only one scapegoated by the Department of Justice. And in the whole financial crisis, I was the only banker to go to jail, ironically enough. You can imagine. So
you were
can
trying to
see how
protect a client, is that correct?
No, they twisted that around. They lied about that. I never hid from him. I asked for a subpoena. I couldn't give his name until they gave me a subpoena. But when the Senate gave me a subpoena, and you can go onto my website, lucifersbanker.com, there's an affidavit by my attorney that said, Mr. Birkenfeld never withheld his client names. To the contrary, he said everything about him to the U.S. Senate. But the DOJ wouldn't give me a subpoena, so they didn't get the information. So what they say is a lie, actually, and it's false. And you can check the record. And what's even more important, because my attorneys read my transcript in the U.S. Senate, where I spent 10 hours testifying, they still won't give me my own sworn testimony to this day, a decade later. Why?
Right. Yeah, that's
So it's
astounding,
troubling at a
actually.
minimum.
Yeah, troubling is
Yeah,
definitely
exactly.
the right word for it. And, to ask my next question, I have to go back a little bit so people understand. I want to go back and ask you what your job entailed precisely. From what I understand, they didn't even have online banking. You didn't get statements. So it's interesting to me how they were able to get their information. From what I understand, you have to fly out to wherever they resided and speak with them that way. I mean, can you go into detail exactly what you did and what you had to do to communicate with clients and how you got clients for that matter?
Certainly. I think what people have to realize is this is a very particular type of banking. Now, you have private banking in the United States, or wealth management and asset management and so forth, and that's fine. But the Swiss had a totally different approach to it. The fees were much higher, and the reason for that were that you had secrecy. You would never disclose the client's name, and you had a secret numbered account, which was protected. And the banks protected this religiously. So this was something that was very important, number one. Number two, you were in a country that was dominated by banks. So the whole atmosphere was banking. Yes, of course, Swiss chocolates and Swiss watches and all of those things and pharmaceuticals. But the banking sector is the primary source of revenue there and brings people to spend money. But what we would do is effectively, it was easy to do because if you're not paying tax, people are very excited to put their money in a zero tax jurisdiction. And essentially, that's what it was. You wouldn't pay income tax, you wouldn't pay capital gains tax, you wouldn't pay inheritance tax. So if you could deal with a client who was maybe international, who had money outside of the United States and did business in the hotel industry or shipping or what have you, then they were very eager to get involved with a large bank in Switzerland because you could put their money there, but also it was tax-free. And we would offer portfolio solutions to them, maybe hedge funds, stocks and bonds, currencies, a whole host of things, possibly offshore companies and trusts that embedded these assets to protect them from lawsuits or litigation down the road. And I think it was very important for the client to understand that we were there to support them in that endeavor so that they could understand what would be the best solution for them to have this money in Switzerland. Vis-a-vis if you were a very rich person, say from Los Angeles or from Chicago or Dallas or New York, you could also have money outside of the U.S., which you felt it was very secure to have it there, and it served a purpose. So that's what we did by marketing to these clients in a variety of ways.
And I remember reading somewhere, and also you told me in the last interview, that at one point you smuggled a client's diamonds. Were you with the client? You smuggled it in a toothpaste container, and was the client with you?
Well, once again, the DOJ lied. They never knew about this, and I never smuggled anything. These were under the value that you're allowed to bring into the country, under $10,000. So that's another lie that you can add to the list the DOJ perpetuated. These were just brought in for a client. We bought them in Geneva, and I brought them by myself on the plane and gave them to him in Texas. So I think the problem here you have is everybody likes to sensationalize stories, and actually that was just one of many things that bankers would do. They would bring an asset to a client, and it was under $10,000, and it wasn't smuggled. I mean, it wasn't like I was bringing in cocaine or heroin or something. So they tried to make me look like the bad guy. And I think the question here is, you've got to ask yourself, and your audience should be scratching their head and say, wait a minute, this has been going on for decades. The Department of Justice has millions of dollars in their budget. They have thousands of agents. They have so much experience in this field. Why did it take one courageous whistleblower to come in and shove it right in front of them, and they still screwed up this case? That's the question that should be asked. And if they can screw up a case like this, I guarantee you, Ella, they can screw up a multitude of cases. And they have, and they've been caught being incompetent and corrupt and criminally complicit. And in my case, I challenge them to that fact, and nobody wants to talk to me about it because they know I'm right. And that's what's really scary. Why is it that our own Department of Justice couldn't break this down? It took one man to do it, and then you attack him? So you see that there's a feeling here of animosity towards the whistleblower, number one. Number two, they don't get the credit. And everybody knows in Washington, it's all about getting the credit. And then they had to admit that I was the whistleblower. And then I got paid all that money. So, you begin to wonder why these people don't like me and still don't like me, which is fine. But it shows that their intent was evil. And that's why I continued this crusade and giving interviews like this, so your audience understands exactly what's been going on. And actually, 350 million Americans have been cheated because Hillary Clinton got involved in this investigation, which we can get into.
Okay, let's go into that a little bit.
Well, it's very
A little more
important, and
detail.
this is a very set. Oh yes, and it's all documented. This is fact now. What I'm saying on your interview here, I don't want people to think I'm just making this up. That's not what I do. As a whistleblower, I don't have to lie, and I don't lie. I tell the truth. The fact is, it's the Senate committee I went to, the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and you can go on my website. All the reports are there. They're about 300 pages, and they make reference to me coming in and giving them this information. Well, there was a Senator Barack Obama who was on that committee but never showed up for one of the hearings on UBS. So he'll argue that he was running for president, and I would give him that. But what I won't give him is the very fact that at the very same time he was running for president and failed to uphold his constitutional oath of defending the Constitution and being a senator and being on that committee, he was receiving millions of dollars of bundled campaign contributions from Robert Wolf, the chairman of UBS Americas. He later put Robert Wolf on two of his committees at the White House. He would play golf with Robert Wolf. So this is a clear conflict of interest, and it never should have happened. Eric Holder, his attorney general, represented UBS in private practice at Covington and Burling, another conflict of interest. And then Barack Obama had Hillary Clinton appointed to get involved in a criminal investigation at UBS in Switzerland, what I exposed. Why would a Secretary of State ever do this? Colin Powell never did this. Condoleezza Rice never did this. John Kerry never did this. So why would Hillary Clinton get involved in this international criminal investigation? And then we found out that she was only negotiating 4,700 names out of 19,000 secret offshore accounts. Well, that's a 75% failure rate right there, Ella. If you fail 75% of the time, I guarantee you'd be fired, or anyone listening to your program. That's number one. Number two, they didn't find the bank properly to make you and all the Americans whole, meaning they made $200 million a year for a 7-year period, 8-year period that they looked at from 2000 to 2007. That's $1.6 billion just to make the U.S. taxpayer whole. But they only fined them $580 million. Why? And they said that was a large amount of money. So you have Barack Obama accepting money from them. You have Eric Holder representing them in private practice before he was appointed AG. You have Hillary Clinton involved in a criminal investigation where she should have no say. And after that, Hillary Clinton's foundation, the Clinton Foundation with her husband, received $500,000 from the Swiss government. And then Bill Clinton got a speaking engagement of $1.2 million, his biggest ever. Why? This is very, very serious.
Yeah, it is very serious. And most people are starting to understand how corrupt the Clinton Foundation really is and was at the time.
But this is it. And all they have to do is go onto my website, spend a half hour to an hour or more, And you'll be tantalized by the documents and the articles that are out there that show the ingrained corruption of the Department of Justice and the Obama administration at this time, and the fact that she got something in return for her soft treatment on the bank. This was the largest bank in the world at the time, Ella. They handled over $1 trillion in assets. One bank. And yet they were undermining our economy, economic espionage, if you will, for decades. And all we do is fine them $580 million, and no of the bankers go to jail, nothing, except you get the whistleblower and put him in jail.
Back, everybody, with one of the most important whistleblowers in history, Mr. Bradley Birkenfeld. So let's pick up where we were right before the break.
Well, that's it, Ella. Thank you. And what I was referring to was the corruption within the Obama administration. And I think it's important for people to understand that this is not just idle chatter or conjecture. This is fact. And when you begin to realize that this was going on at this time, and they felt as though that they were suited to do this, they cheated the American people, and by their direct actions or inactions in this sense, and the cover-up. So really, you have 350 million victims in the United States due to this cover-up by Hillary Clinton and Eric Holder and Barack Obama. So really, in the end, you begin to ask yourself, if you're not going to prosecute the perpetrators here, you're sending a very bad precedent, number one. And number two, you're then condoning this type of activity to say, do it again, and do it again. Why do you think we continue to have these banking problems? Because they've done nothing to curtail it. So there's a lot of hardworking Americans out there, and probably listeners on your show, that are saying, wait a minute, why do we have to bear the burden of these big banks? Why do we have to keep paying taxes and they get away with this? So I think that's really where there's a lot of soul searching that must be done. And as I said, in my book, my website, I actually outline this very clearly so that people understand it. And I hope they understand that this is something that should never happen again.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk a little bit about the French case?
Yes. Now, that's a very interesting case. Believe it or not, the United States government, when I was on probation in America, I asked them to get off of probation, and they wouldn't curtail it. So I was a little bit stunned by that. Didn't understand why, but obviously they were upset that I made them look like fools and exposed them as the whistleblower. So what I did was I ultimately hired an attorney in Paris, who then came and visited me in the States, and then he talked to the judge, the presiding judge in France that was going after UBS, and issued me a federal subpoena. And then the Department of Justice had to let me go to France to testify. I mean, these are the extent I had to go to just to expose these people for what they were doing. And it's very troubling. And what had happened was I testified for about 10 hours in Paris back in 2015. Well, the trial just ended, and they had a verdict in February of this year. And you can imagine, this was the same issues that the U.S. went after UBS for because of my whistleblowing back in 2007. Well, the French were much more successful. They were able to get 5.1 billion in a verdict against UBS. That's 5.1 billion euro. So that's about $5.5 billion. And we only got 580. So you begin to ask yourself, that's a big issue here, and why is such a discrepancy? And I think now you begin to realize when you put the pieces of this puzzle together, as I have today on your show, people are really starting to get angry and saying this is something that's totally unacceptable. And I've pushed for hearings in the U.S. Senate so that people can understand the truth, so they see me on television, hear my voice, see my documents, and understand that I tried to do the best I could to protect the American people and protect this instance. And report it as a whistleblower. But you can see
one thing I wanted to
in
interject.
politics.
I just have a quick question before we get too far ahead of ourselves here. Was Stephanie Joba, was she one of the whistleblowers in France that whistleblew on UBS? Because I interviewed her and she talked a lot about this, and I was wondering if you're familiar with her.
I am familiar with Stephanie Joba, and she was a marketing person there at UBS in Paris, and she knew a lot of information. I actually met her in the United States as well as in Paris, and we shared a lot of notes and information and so forth, which further corroborated what she thought and certainly corroborated my story. So this is not, again, just some people making gossip. This is actual factual criminal conduct. And Stephanie, like I said, was a marketing person, so she wasn't like myself, a banker per se, that actually had clients, but she certainly was well aware of what was going on and provided a lot of assistance to the French authorities like I did, along with a few other whistleblowers in France. Hence why you got a 5.1 billion euro verdict, which UBS obviously appealed. So you can imagine this is the largest fine in French history. I mean, that's how important this is. Now you have other countries taking up the same role. Germany and Italy and Spain are starting to look at UBS and saying, hey, maybe we should start looking at them to see what kind of court trial we should hold to hold them accountable for all these transgressions over the many decades.
Mm-hmm. The one thing I have to say, I really adore her. I enjoyed our interview. In France, they don't have like a finder's fee, so she's still looking for work and she's barely getting by. I mean, just think if she was an American resident and what she could possibly gain from whistleblowing. So I feel for her. She's really struggling. They need to start implementing some whistleblower, not just protections, but something similar to what the U.S. does. It incentivizes people feeling comfortable to come forward and talk about disclosures and corruption in certain corporations and banking and organizations.
Well, you're exactly right. And I think what people must understand is that whistleblowers are an extension of law enforcement. It's that simple. You have people within organizations that have a lot of data, firsthand information, and so forth. And in order to eradicate waste, fraud, and corruption in our society today, we must condone and promote whistleblowing, because it's not about just tit for tat, meaning maybe an ex-boyfriend and girlfriend argue over a few $1,000s in taxes. Not something like that. We're talking about the big corporate fraud that has seeped into our society. Now, this is something that must be eradicated, as I said. So I think whistleblowing laws have to be put in place to protect whistleblowers, number one, and also to compensate them and incentivize them, as you rightly point out. Why? Who's going to risk their whole career, their reputation, their finances, their family, and never work again because there'll be backlash against them and retaliated against? So they must put this in place because the risk-reward level is so great for the country when you bring in some of these crimes that they go unnoticed. And
you're not going to get hired again. That's the other thing. If you're going to, oftentimes, especially in her case, she's been blacklisted. Who wants to hire a whistleblower? So I absolutely agree with you.
But look at all the cases that we've had so far. Again, on my website, lucifersbanker.com, you'll see a press release by Senator Grassley, the champion of whistleblowers, who wrote the law and passed it. And what happens is they've brought in over $60 billion into the U.S. economy just from whistleblowers. And this was 3 years ago when the press release came out. So you can only imagine the amount of monies that come in. And remember, for your audience, this is important that they understand that the whistleblowing awards, 15 to 30% get paid from the fraud that gets uncovered, not from the taxpayers. So really, you're just taking a small portion of what was recovered, giving it to the whistleblower because you wouldn't have it without the whistleblower. The government takes the bulk of it, and the crime is eradicated. It's a win-win-win. The only people who lose are the bad guys.
Yeah, I agree. And then, what was the question I had? You had shared that you spent time in prison. Would you mind going into the details of that? I'm very curious what you thought when you found out you had to spend time in prison, what it was like, what you thought after you left, as far as like I don't know. I'm just curious what your experience was during this duration of time.
Well, I must admit I found it quite interesting because the whole situation opened my eyes to the criminal justice system in America. Quite frankly, it's a business. It's not justice, and this is really quite scary for your audience because, and maybe they know examples of this through their own experiences or family members and friends, but it is a business. It's building prisons, incarcerating people at a tremendous rate. Prosecutors have so much leeway to lie and deceive and cheat and steal in the courtroom, and they've been caught multiple times in many cases in many states, and this is unacceptable. So when I went into prison, I went in with a stiff upper lip, if you will, knowing that I was scapegoated, knowing that I should have never been there. The fact that I was the only one, I mean, this is the most ridiculous conviction in history. And the fact that they brought in over $25 billion today because of me and eradicated a business they could never penetrate. But in prison, I also saw a lot of things where these convicted felons they were taken advantage of. They were either maybe black or Hispanic. They didn't have much money. They didn't have good legal counsel. And the government pretty much just piles on charges and you're defenseless. You can't fight. And this is really sad. And I think a lot of people know what I'm saying when I say these things, but also to see guards stealing clothes and lawnmowers and snow blowers. Who's going to report them? An inmate? No one's going to listen. But we saw it. We saw it time and time again, the way in which the whole system is corrupted from the core. And this is really quite scary. But what I did was we didn't have prison cells or fences around our facility. It was a camp. It's called a camp. It's a very low security place. Now, you could literally run through the woods like most people did and get food and, I don't know, drugs or cigarettes or whatever. And as long as you came back, you were fine. But obviously, I never did that. And I think it was a very open society where you could work out, play softball, bocce, and tennis, which makes no sense. You're putting these people in this type of facility. They can't work. They can't pay taxes, and you're destroying their life by giving them a conviction forever. For me, obviously, I was very fortunate because I got my whistleblowing award, and it was very sizable. So that's a different thing altogether. But most of these other people are suffering, and this is what society does here in America. They churn out convictions time and time and time again, and they're unemployable. So whether you're a whistleblower that's unemployable, in my case, thank goodness I'm very wealthy, but for them, they're very poor, and they have no choice. So what do you think they're going to do? Probably go back to the crime that got them there in the first place, if they, in fact, committed a crime.
Well, how do they differentiate who goes into this different type of prison system? Like you said, it was very open and you could actually leave and do all these things. Why were you allowed to go to that particular place as opposed to one of these hard prisons where there's bars and you can't go anywhere, and the way that everybody thinks that a prison really is?
Well, you do have some violent criminals, let's be fair. I mean, there's a lot of people who are very dangerous, and those people should be incarcerated, that's for sure. Maybe repeat offenders as well.
Right.
You know, everything from murder to rape and all these very violent crimes, which deserve justice, obviously. The problem is on these lower level crimes, which are, some of them are quite petty in size, first-time offenders, but yet, you could get a prosecutor or a judge that just goes crazy and just gives these enormous sentences. The very fact that you see people that get sentences that are so limited is ridiculous. I mean, you think of this guy, Theo Epstein, who was abusing little children. I mean, it's a pedophilia crime.
It's disgusting.
And he was given, it was given, like, say, 16 months or something. I got 30 months for exposing $1 billion fraud. Are you joking? I mean, this is why the system is so backwards. I mean, it's like Alice in Wonderland. Up is down and down is up. I mean, it makes no sense. So again, you don't have a justice system. It's totally unequitable. Number one. Number two, it's corrupted. Number two, and number three, it's over the top. It's a business. They get the judges, they get the prosecutors, they get probation, they build the prisons. This is a money-making machine. I think the numbers in California alone. Yeah, in California alone, I think it's $60 billion that's put aside for criminal justice. I mean, it's outrageous.
How is the money? How does it trickle? Who is it going to? Like, we understand there's corruption in the government. I guess my first question is, what's the who overlooks where's the oversight with the DOJ? Or is there at all?
Well, see, again, the DOJ's, you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. Certainly the DOJ is the problem. So that's what we're facing, unfortunately. So really, who are you going to complain to? An inspector general or someone else? This is ingrained. This is almost like we're numb to it. It's almost acceptable that we just incarcerate people and that's it. And we give them big budgets to run these businesses. And I think this is really, really dangerous for society because you're breeding a whole group of people who become unemployable when they get out. And, what do you think they're going to do? They're obviously going to go back to some of their ways that got them there in the first place. So this idea of rehabilitation doesn't even work because they don't do it. They don't help and try and assist. So I think it's important that people understand that there's much more to this than meets the eye. And it certainly needs a lot of reforms in the criminal justice system. It's quite corrupt.
Yeah, that is coming to light. And then also, because marijuana is now legal in several states, it's an issue with the people who have been jailed because of selling marijuana. And from what I understand, they're trying to pass something so they can get out early from the prison system.
Yes, an early release and so forth, and maybe expunge their record and all of that. Mm-hmm. But, a lot of the damage has been done, Ella. These people,
of course,
mentally, physically, financially, socially, you have a lot of baggage with that. And everyone's different, of course, because they have different backgrounds and different upbringings and education and what have you. So it's just, it's a shame to see that we even have to discuss this in a country like America that says we're so free and democratic. But, the big corporate crimes is what I really focus on because they've done really nothing to prevent them. And Eric Holder even admitted some of these banks are too big to jail. But he says it would cause a big problem in the financial markets. They're the reason why we have a problem in the financial markets, this idiot. I mean, he doesn't even understand the complexity of why these financial institutions get away with this, and they do nothing to enforce it. But yet they're very happy to represent them in private practice and receive millions of dollars in legal fees. It is a joke. The whole thing is a joke.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely. It's just, there's so much corruption, even in our own country. I don't know percentage wise. I mean, I don't know. We do have some freedoms, or at least we were built on freedoms and the Constitution. Unfortunately, it's just not that's not the reality of our country at this time and place.
Well, this is it. And I think we're all sort of doing some soul searching here to find, why do you think Donald Trump became president? He became president because people were fed up with the corruption in the society of what we had previously. I mean,
you got it.
I mean, Hillary, right? People just said, enough's enough. We want change. Now, look, is he a tough guy? Is he someone maybe a bit vulgar? He does a lot of things on Twitter or whatever. He's not a politician and he's not a general, which are most of the presidents we've ever had in the Oval Office. So he comes out, and I firmly believe he loves his country, and I think he goes after it in a way. He says he's going to put things up. He's going to put the border wall up, which was one of his promises in the campaign. He went after China. He puts tariffs in. Yes, they could be a bit harming to our people and businesses, but in the long run, it shows that we're not going to be pushed around, as Obama did for 8 years. He brought back more prisoners overseas than Obama did in 8 years so far. So why are you criticizing this man? It's you may not like him. You may be upset that your candidate, Hillary Clinton, lost, but that's life. Move on. This man's the president of the United States, had nothing to do with Russia, had nothing to do with this conspiracy nonsense. This is a fallacy, fake drama. And people are tired of it. I mean, people are really tired of it. And I really think he gets reelected because of this, because they're just making noises about him. Where is their agenda? Why aren't they creating jobs like he is? Cutting taxes. The stock market's moving up. Lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. I mean, this is incredible. But if you don't like them, you don't like them. So they just come up with all these little circus antics. I mean, it's really ridiculous. And actually, we're laughing stock overseas. People are just laughing at us. This is
It's
what you
true.
spend your time on?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's a mess. But I firmly believe, look, nobody's perfect. I'm not going to say he's perfect. Nobody is. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. But the point is, I think he firmly believes that he loves his country, and he's done a lot of things to prove that, and he's gone out of his way to make sure that the law is upheld on immigration, on lower taxes, on trying to improve our standing in the world. Everyone's so quick to accuse him of being, he's going to get us into World War III. Of course he's not going to get us into World War III. What kind of nonsense is this? Or calling him a Nazi or treasonous. I mean, these are the kinds of words that people are using. I mean, this is outrageous. So I hope your audience understands my position on this, because it dovetails with what I did. Is I brought back a lot of money to this country. I made America great. I brought back $20 to $25 billion and counting. And I eradicated an illegal business that no one could penetrate. How about that? I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. I'll tell you that. What do you think, just to discuss whistleblowers in general, what do you think about, I'll ask you about someone specific, what do you think about what happened to Julian Assange?
Well, that's an interesting question. I actually met with Julian twice in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And people were surprised when I said this, and I said it for several reasons. Whether you like him or hate him, that's another issue. That's not my point. My point was, on my website, he, through WikiLeaks, released a covert CIA document that proved that Hillary Clinton was finding a political solution to the UBS case, not a justice situation. And if you go under it, on the website, under DOJ corruption, you'll see it there. And it was printed in a Norwegian newspaper back 10 years ago. So what's interesting about this is very, very telling, is that WikiLeaks, again, whether you like them or hate them, or Mr. Assange, the fact of the matter is he has a lot of information with respect to this. And that's something I found very interesting. So when I met with him on 2 different occasions, I did give him my book signed, and he gave me his book signed. And we had a nice conversation about why Hillary would get involved in such a thing, and why would she have her servers at home? And he quickly said it was a FOIA reason, a Freedom of Information Act. And for your audience, that's something where people can come in and request documents on a person that are in the freedom of the public. Well, he immediately said she could avoid FOIA because she put her server at home, and she knew this. So she was very devious from the get-go. President Obama knew it as well. Eric Holder knew it as well. I mean, this is a crime, and yet everyone just poo-poos it. Oh no, that's fine and all that. No, it's not fine, because this was a law that was broken, and she feels like she's above the law, and that's exactly what's happened here. Our justice system has been corrupted from within, and so this is very dangerous. So hopefully we'll see some more documents from Mr. Assange at some point. I'm sure you're going to, and hopefully more about the UBS case, because it just shows that this was a fix. And 350 million Americans got cheated because of Hillary Clinton.
Mm-hmm. And then you wrote a book eventually. So what compelled you to do that?
Well, again, I don't need the money, as you know, Ella.
I know you don't. You're not hurt.
I'm not inherited.
So. Mm-hmm.
I'm not hurt, no, and I don't have to work, thank goodness. But I enjoy helping other whistleblowers, as I've said in many interviews, and I do that. I'm here in the United States, but I do live in Europe. And what I did was, by writing the book, which was first done in English, not one English publisher would publish my book, because I put things in there about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Eric Holder. And they said, well, we need a year to publish it. I said, you don't need a year. You're lying to me. So I fired them. That was Penguin. It was Hachette. It was Simon & Schuster. All these firms wouldn't do it. So I had to self-publish my book. That's a very interesting story, because I wanted it out before the election. Ultimately, it got out a month before the election, and some of this was really related to where Donald Trump nicknamed Hillary Crooked Hillary. The UBS case is a case in point. And the book is there to educate and inform people about how corrupt our system really is. And I'm adamant about it. I don't need the money. I did it because I wanted to tell the people the story. And now the book is in 8 languages. I travel around the world and lecture about the book. Most of the time I lecture for free. Sometimes people hire me. That's fine. But the main thing here is to really get out to the next generation of children and make sure they understand this, not only here in America, but also overseas. We have to make sure that this story is told time and time and time again, because this is so serious. And if we continue to let it happen, then we're all losing and they're winning. And this is something that we cannot accept.
Well, what plans do you have in the future? We're finishing up. We just have a couple more minutes here. So tell us about that. What plans do you have?
Well, I'm most likely going to do a second book. I have enough content for that, and to make it interesting for the reading audience. I have some agents that are promoting the story of Lucifer's banker in Los Angeles as well as in Europe for a TV series or a possible TV series. And I continue to lecture and so forth, and most likely set up a whistleblowing office to help whistleblowers, not just in Europe where the laws don't protect them, but also to help them get some comfort, some possibly financial assistance, as well as help them file claims if they have legitimate claims and file them properly so that they can be compensated and they can and walk away from what they're doing. It's very important.
This is perfect content for a film too. I really hope that maybe gets made into a movie.
Well, we're pushing for it, and if we do a TV series, the movie would certainly follow, because they said there's so much content to put it into a movie. They said a TV series would work best, and then the movie afterwards. But I'm happy to do it, and I think it's important for people to understand not only the story, which is so amazing, it's unprecedented, but it also helps people understand what kind of society we live in today. And that's very important. And I think that's really the crux of having a book, so people can really point to it and refer to it and say, wow, I never knew this was going on.
Bradley, it's been a pleasure. I hope to speak to you soon, and thank you for the interview.